Very warm welcome to Dialogues. I'm Arko Chattopadhyay. I teach in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department in IIT Gandhinagar. I'm doing this little intro because Professor Madhumita Sengupta would be, she says sorry because she's in another talk and she will perhaps be late into this meeting. So I'll just very briefly get the process started and then we can move to the talk that we have today. So very warm welcome to this talk by Professor Upal Chakrabarti, who is an assistant professor of sociology in Presidency University. As I've known him for a number of years, I would perhaps call him Upalda if he's fine with that. And we will have a talk that is titled on scale, political economy, and the local. And of course, I would request all the audience members here to make sure that their audio remains mute throughout the talk. We'll have his talk and then a response and a conversation and a Q&A to end with. At the time of Q&A, of course, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you could put it in the chat box. That's it as far as the housekeeping announcements are concerned. And I would now request Manas Patra, who is a PhD student in the department, to formally introduce Professor Chakrabarti. Thank you. Over to you, Manas.
Thank you so much. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah. You are. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarti, for agreeing to come and deliver a talk here on Dialogues. Before we begin, though, I would like to introduce Professor Chakrabarti to the audience. So Professor Chakrabarti teaches sociology at the Presidency University in Kolkata. His doctoral thesis was published recently as Assembling the Local, Political Economy and Agrarian Governance in British India from the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. His research and teaching interests include agrarian sociology, history of ideas, history of science, economic anthropology, and colonial South Asia. At present, he is also involved in building an archive of the institutional records of Hindu College or Presidency College. His writings have also appeared and are forthcoming in journals like Modern Asian Studies, Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, and the South Asian History and Culture. Today, Professor Chakrabarti will be talking on the key conceptual concerns of his book, Assembling the Local, Political Economy and Agrarian Governance in British India, pertaining to the articulations of the local on multiple theoretical and empirical fronts, weaving them into a complex reflection on the problem of difference and a critical commentary on the connections between political economy, agrarian property, and the governance. So, Professor Chakrabarti, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manas, and thank you, Orko and Madhumita at IIT Gandhinagar for giving me this opportunity to actually today's paper is not really a specific paper per se. It will be more about the book as a whole, assuming that that the book has not yet been read by most in the audience. I'll be presenting some key ideas of the book and mostly summarizing the spread of the work and focus on maybe some of the conceptual concerns of the book. And that's why, so it's a great occasion for me to share my thoughts with you all. And thank you to Orko, Madhumita, and Manas for allowing me to do this. So I'll be talking about the book as a whole, the key concerns which inform this work. And it's not going to be a particular paper focusing on the demonstration of a particular idea based on a specific set of historical materials. The key concerns of the book are few. Some relate to conversations and materials specific to the discipline of history and the practice of historians. Some are about problems which historians have raised but are certainly relevant for other social scientists as well. anyone who has an interest in colonial South Asia. Then there are concerns which belong to conceptual fields, where I ask what kind of figures of thought will be useful for my purposes in this book and why. So assuming there are not many historians in the audience, I will at times clarify details of the historical field I work on, which means I'll make observations which might appear commonplace to historians, but would be necessary information for others to get a general sense of the book. So let me start with the empirical time-space coordinates of the book. It deals roughly with a period of 60 to 70 years, from the 1790s to the 1860s. The spaces it looks into are of three kinds. So one, I look into this administrative division on the eastern coast of India called Cuttack, which was classified as the 19th division of the Bengal presidency. And it was occupied by the East India Company's government in 1803. The division comprised of areas which are part of the present-day state of Orissa, but mostly the coastal stretch and the riverine plains of central Orissa. The book looks into the formation of agrarian property relations in this area over a period of roughly 60 years, starting from its annexation in 1803 by the East India Company. The second space this book deals with are interregional governance practices. By this, I mean volumes of debates, discussions, representations, legislations, notes, which were generated by the administrative officials of the East India Company over the first half of the 19th century. These officials were deputed in different parts of British India, entrusted with the task of settling the land revenue of different territories. Sequence following which the East India Company's government acquired territories in the 19th century and settled their land revenues. Most of us maybe are familiar with this, that this started off with certain areas of Bengal, which then moved on again to parts of this whole process of acquiring territories and settling the land revenues of those territories. This started off with certain parts of Bengal, then it moved on to parts of southern India, then more or less simultaneously to parts of western India and northern India, and then to further north and northeastern frontiers. Then it returned to certain parts of central India. This is how the company's government moved in terms of acquiring newer territories and settling land revenues in each of these territories. Now, as these lands got settled across a huge expanse of the bureaucratic machinery of imperialism, colonial officials discussed their experiences, thoughts, and practices around mainly the question of property rights in land in the period that I examined. So most of the 19th century, as I said, 1790s to 1860s. During this period, across this complex, evolving and expanded bureaucratic apparatus, which stretched from the Court of Directors in London to the deputy collectors in different districts, what were being discussed in the process of settling these lands were mainly various issues around the question of property rights in land. So mainly, so for example, who owned land in India, what kind of an ownership it was, how should the company's government in order to extract revenue from these lands, make arrangements with these property owners in land, if at all there were such property owners, and if there were, what kind of rights these were, which needed clarification. And there went on volumes of writings, there were produced volumes of writings on questions of property rights in land during this period. Only the mainstay of governance in the first half of the 19th century. So, in a sense, therefore, this period can also be seen as the time when the company's government laid the foundations of the governmental engagement with property in land in agrarian India. The third space that this book deals with is mainly a set of debates within political economy in 19th century Britain. Now, political economy, for those who are aware about its history, was a absolutely critical body of thought, which emerged through complex negotiations from earlier genealogies of disciplines like moral philosophy, or let's say fields of study like moral philosophy, and it emerged as a defined, codified body of thought, mostly in the 19th century, in the context of certain countries of Western Europe, specifically Britain. In Britain, there was indeed quite a conversation on defining this field of thought, and there were tall figures within this field of thought who had an enormous influence on not only this field of thought, but on the fact that political economy as a field of thought was very influential for practices of government. And these political economists, therefore, were also very important for such practices in British politics as well as in the imperial world. For those who are not aware of this, there was this institution in Britain at that time called the East India College, which was sort of a training ground for for administrative officials moving to British India for official work. And political economy was one of the central part of the curriculum that was imparted at this college. So be it the imperial world, the wider imperial world, or be it the domestic context of metropolitan Britain in the 19th century, political economy was certainly one of the most defining fields of thought for a fastly developing industrial and colonial society. So this book, in terms of the third space that it deals with, it looks at mainly a set of debates within political economy in 19th century Britain. These debates revolved around questions of method and science in political economy. In these debates, the dominant framework of political economy at that time, which emerged from the writings of David Ricardo, were questioned by a contemporary political economist, Richard Jones. Ricardo's writings were questioned for being a priori, abstract, and falsely universalist. By challenging the framing of some of the chief categories of Ricardian political economy, like rent, wages, and labor itself, Richard Jones argued that these categories worked differently for different parts of the world. Jones demonstrated that it is primarily the interrelationship between the form of property and nature of political power, which determined these categories differently for different populations. Now, incidentally, Jones was also a professor of political economy at this institution that I was referring to a while ago, called the East India College. And he was, this part I can talk about in greater details. maybe in the discussion. But his critique of Ricardianism was coming out from a broader intellectual movement which in the name of Baconian empiricism was trying to codify questions of method for the natural and moral sciences much more broadly. And then this movement was it developed mostly out of the University of Cambridge, and the people who were part of this intellectual movement, they were scholars in different fields. Some of them are widely known as important scientists of that period. For example, Charles Babbage, and William Whewell. Jones was a part of this group, and he was a political economist. And it needs to be understood that the field of political economy during that period in Britain was quite big, heterogeneous, and while certainly Ricardian ideas of political economy were the defining ideas in the field, they were also critically engaged with from a whole lot of perspectives. And this particular perspective that I pick on was important, as it was not only Jones, but a lot of other people around Jones who were making this argument about the false deductivism or the false a priori nature of Ricardian universals. And Jones was instrumental in making perhaps the most detailed exposition of this line of critique, because in his own works, what he did, he gathered materials, historical materials, and a lot of materials collected from travelers' observations, which can also be called quasi-ethnographic. So quasi-ethnographic, historical, and also statistical material, because it was also a time when the discipline of statistics was being codified and brought within the dedicated for the study of science in Britain. So statistical, historical, and ethnographic materials were the basis for this critique of Jones, who wrote in his works, who presented these materials in his work to demonstrate how in different parts of the world, different populations, because of their different histories of, as I said, the development of the relation between political power and form of property, because of the development of this, the differential development of this relation in different parts of the world, the chief political economic categories like rent, like wage, like profit, like labor, actually assumed very different forms for different populations, which is why Jones argued that Ricardian universalism, the way Ricardo defined these categories, would not be applicable for the greater part of the world. So I look at this debate, and of course, these are details which can be referred to later, but just for the sake of the discussion, flow of the discussion right now. Of course, Richard Jones, the materials that he presented, the historical materials that he presented to make his argument, actually emerged from studies of various nations of the world, ranging from differences within Europe, so studies of Eastern European nations, the conditions of which were very different from Western European nations at that time, to obviously studies of Asian nations, to studies of South American nations, African nations, etc. But then a great part of Jones's observations was also based on his extensive commentary on Indian agricultural conditions. And very interestingly, he often used his notes on both his notes as well as his published writings on Indian agricultural conditions to teach political economy to his students at Haileybury. One thing must be kept in mind, that these students were also future colonial officials for British India. So this is the third space that I deal with in this book. Now, the problem, as I see it, I bring these three different spaces together in the book and consider them as one analytical field, is that of local difference, or the local as difference in each of these fields. So in each of these fields, the particulars of the field come up as an issue to be negotiated with and settled. In the political economy debates in Britain, the universality or the universal applicability of Ricardian categories are questioned, as they are considered to be inapplicable to particular populations, nations, property power ensembles, or sovereignties. In the interregional governance practices of British India, agrarian property forms or land tenures throw up the same problem of local difference. As the government, this I'll clarify in a bit. What do I mean by this? See, as the government annexed territories, as I said, progressively the East India Company's government kept on annexing more and more territories. They encountered newer agrarian communities, and obviously, because in the process of, in order to news for each territory, what needed to be first of all known, understood, and sorted out was the issue of property rights in land, which is why for each of these territories and the variety that they presented, the newness that they presented, once again, local difference became the defining point for all these interregional governance practices. So as the government annexed territories, officials argued that the model of settlement used previously would not work for the new territory, as property forms and peasant types varied immensely. So maybe some of us know that there are these models of revenue settlements which were introduced by the company's government. The famous permanent settlement of Bengal stands as one of the earliest models of revenue settlement which was introduced by the company's government. Now, for each of these new annexations and the movements into more and more territories of British India, earlier models were considered to be invalid, inapplicable, and therefore, were considered to fall flat on the face of the local differences that the company's government encountered. So the government encountered a fantastic diversity of tenures and peasants, which they started to then categorize, sharing notes between regions, eventually drawing up a classificatory grid and distributing agrarian property types and peasant figures across this grid in terms of a history of change in the forms of sovereignty, which they noted corresponded with changes in types of property and peasants. So what the government did, as they encountered newer and newer forms, they started developing a classificatory model of categorizing these forms and distributing them over the entire classificatory frame, arranging them, plotting relations between them, etc. And all of this was happening across regions, because there were these major documents which were written up by big regional administrators, which then had their own lives of circulation beyond their specific region. And there was indeed a lot of sharing of administrative experience going on across regions, through which this classification emerged. And the basis of this classification was the changing history of sovereignty in every region corresponding to which the specific property type of that region developed. This was the basis of the classification of the colonial classifications. The officials understood the differences in these terms. They saw that, okay, if this particular peasant type and this particular form of land tenure exists in this particular region, this is because this region has a specific history of sovereignty. Nature of sovereignty in this region developed in these ways, and depending on and linked to these developments, changes in the nature of sovereignty, there emerged specific property types and peasant forms in that region. So once again, property as an effect of sovereignty became the basis for explaining different for these officials in these different regions of British India. Now, this process itself is taken up in this book, both at the level of the interregional scale, but also at the level of a specific instance, that being the territory of Cuttack, the 19th division of Bengal Presidency, a pretty much small compared to many other areas of the Bengal Presidency in terms of its revenue yielding capacity, a relatively smaller place. And in this region as well, as I write in this book, as I explore in this book, the older model of revenue and property fixation, which, if you remember, the Bengal model of revenue and property settlement was the famous Zamindari permanent settlement, pioneered by, the idea of which was pioneered by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. It was established as a legislation, and then over, let's say, the next few years, it was implemented across the region. But very interestingly, and this is something known by historians, and historians in various ways have accounted for this. And in a way, my book also tries to account for it, but not only for this particular policy or legislation, but the book tries to look at at a specific moment in the career of this legislation in the light of certain other broader trends as well. So what I'm talking about is this very interesting phenomenon when almost right after this huge grand arrangement of revenue fixation called the permanent settlement, right after it was instituted, it started being heavily criticized within the colonial sphere. So colonial officials themselves, once again, spread over a big range of bureaucratic positions and locations. So colonial officials, both from within Bengal as well as officials from outside Bengal, from the south initially, and then also what was classified as the northwestern provinces, broadly comprising the present-day state of Uttar Pradesh. All these officials started criticizing the permanent settlement as a model of revenue settlement right after the permanent settlement was instituted. So 1793, it was instituted. By the first decade of the 19th century, the permanent settlement as a model of revenue settlement was seriously put under serious scrutiny and criticism. What was being argued here was that the model of revenue settlement adopted in Bengal cannot be extended to other parts of British India, because once again, these other parts all consisted of locally varying differential forms of land tenures, peasants, and agrarian arrangements, which, unless unconsidered in their own terms, cannot be cannot cannot move towards a suitable basis for revenue settlement, uh, of the colonial state. The point that I was making a while ago about interregional conversations around the inapplicability of revenue settlements, around the challenge of local variation in understanding property. That point starts actually from Bengal. That conversation starts from Bengal. And it starts very interestingly right at the very moment a model is established. A critique of that model emerges soon after that. So following the trail of that conversation, if we now look at the specific instance of Cuttack, of the locality in eastern India that I have closely studied in the book, then we see obviously that although Cuttack was part of Bengal presidency, it was the 19th division, a new addition to the expanding area of Bengal presidency. The Bengal model of revenue settlement was not extended to this place. And this is not only true of Cuttack, many other parts of Bengal presidency which were added to this territorial whole after the permanent settlement almost never saw the extension of the zamindari model of permanent settlement to those places, which include parts of the present-day state of Bihar and Orissa particularly. So in Cuttack too, what happened is that once the British occupied Cuttack in 1803, a few experimental short-term settlements were introduced. And very soon we see a massive insurrection breaking through the entire length of the province and led by the native peasant militia. This is in 1817. And once the insurrection is quelled, extensive surveys and settlement operations are carried out in Cuttack, which then define property titles, fix peasant rolls, and settle the whole field of difference in Cuttack. But once again, once these survey and settlement operations were over, this was sometime in the 1840s when they were over, very soon, this settlement of Cuttack was again taken up, challenged, through a flood of litigation which swept the district courts, and a whole range of ranging from big landlords to smaller peasants, village-based agrarian kind of magnates, chiefs, all of them together flooded the district courts with litigation, and their main object of attack was the settlement that had just finished in Cuttack, and what all the settlement introduced, the whole regime of property, of people occupying property rights, of peasants having certain roles within these property rights, etc. All of that settlement was immediately questioned from the 1840s, and this litigation went on till the 1860s. Now, so once again, even in the case of the specific instance of Cuttack, we see that the issue of local difference kind of runs through the entire period of broadly the period that I examined, the entire first half of the 19th century. The entire the issue of local difference runs through this time period in the life of this specific territory as well. So, be it in these three different spaces, what I see, the way I bring them together is around this whole issue of local difference. Now, generally, across this entire range of governmental operations over different territories, a major shift in agrarian power also could be observed over this period. Big landlords who were granted quasi-proprietary rights and particular sovereignties riding on those rights saw their control being lost to village-level chiefs or the subordinate peasantry. Now, this was caused by the colonial ordering of difference, which framed the peasant cultivator as the original right-bearing subject, having proprietary rights shared with the state. The governmental search for this original peasant resulted in reclassifying the village chiefs and other substantial peasantry as belonging to the lost ancient lineage of the propertied subject. This capacitated these figures at the cost of older landlords on the one hand, and the poorer unpropertied cultivators on the other. So this whole process of settling local difference by drawing up a classificatory grid, whereby each location and position within this grid could be explained effect of the history of sovereignty of that region, which reflected itself on the nature of property in that region as well. This whole process of settlement also led to this other change, which is a change in the dynamics of agrarian power. The big landlords who were the first allies of the company's government, who were given extensively quasi-proprietary rights and other forms of control by the first model of settlement, that's the Bengal permanent zamindari settlement. Those big landlords no longer retained the same sense of uncontested supremacy. So as the company settled this difference, and as they drew up this classificatory grid, they, following the logic of investigating the history of sovereignty in every region, they actually went back to claim that in India, property rights originally existed with the peasant, who shared these rights with the state. Now, what we are trying to do, we are also trying to restore this original form, and therefore we are trying to uphold the rights of the peasants. Now, this, of course, did not straightforwardly mean that the colonial government was upholding the rights of the cultivators on the ground, but the figure of the peasant, which was absolutely central to the classificatory topography of sovereignty and property, which the colonial regime drew up based on the idea of local difference. Out of that, what emerged was a shift from granting power and sovereignty to big landlords earlier to the reinvestment of property rights and local sovereignties to other kinds of peasantry, which were mostly village level dominant groups of peasants. So this process continued throughout the first half of the 19th century. The political economic category of rent, which was the defining index for the main political economic questions related to production and distribution, featured centrally everywhere in the debates over method in Britain, in the interregional practices of governance in British, in the property matters of specific localities like Cuttack. And in each of these sites, rent got redefined in terms, redefined as an effect of sovereignty and property, which made distribution, the idea of the political economic idea of distribution, conditional on local differences, and labor as production shaped by the same differences. So this once again will be known to people who are familiar with the history of political economy, but for those who are not, and also the history of colonial South Asia, its agrarian history especially, that obviously in settling revenues, the guiding political economic category for the colonial government was rent. And it was based on the definition of rent, at how the government defined rent, that revenues got settled. And in order to define rent, they had to define property. And what we see in each of these instances, each of these spaces that I take up in this book, be it the political economic debates in Britain, or the interregional agrarian governance practices in British India, or the property or the development of the property regime of Cuttack, the specific locality in question. For each of these sites, rent was being defined as an effect of political power, of sovereignty, which had to be traced by the government since time immemorial. And based on that tracing, a grid had to be created. The grid was created, and the local differences in property forms were mapped across this grid. So drawing from this work of the local, I make some arguments in the book engaging with different fields of South Asian history. Now, a long and rich tradition of agrarian history has seen such local differences unproblematical as simply particulars existing on the ground, which shaped or were shaped by colonial power knowledge formations. Against both these positions, I note that the local itself was the effect of a complex colonial order. I call this order the assemblage of political economy. This assemblage, contrary to being a straightforward juxtaposition of 19th century political economic universals on colonial governance, was produced out of the framing of difference, out of the totalizing of particulars, which emerged dynamically across these three sides, therefore making political economy itself a form of governance. Now, for this part, I wish to read from in the book. Now, on this part, actually, for this part, the book turns to an engagement with some works of Michel Foucault in order to construct a theoretical relation between political economy and governance. I propose a conversation between Foucault's characterization of political economy as a formation of knowledge in the modern episteme and his genealogy of liberal governance. Now, Foucault argues that the shift in the structure of discourse from the classical to the modern episteme was marked by a change from representation to its limits. As he demonstrates, by the end of the 18th century, a new discursive constellation had emerged of producing knowledge about life, labor, and language, congealing around the disciplines of biology, philology, and political economy, respectively. This epistemic shift generated labor or production as the epistemological object of political economy. The manner in which the category of labor as production was formulated in political economy, especially with Ricardo, Foucault notes, revealed changes at a deeper level of thought. The mode of being of things was no longer considered as representable. They could not be horizontally distributed over a table of equivalence in terms of identities and differences. Rather, I quote, they turn in upon themselves, posit their own volumes, and define for themselves an internal space which to our representation is on the exterior. The very being of that which is represented is now going to fall outside representation itself, unquote. Now, particularly speaking, in terms of the birth of political economy, this entailed a move away from exchange as the basis of analysis of wealth to labor as the condition of possibility for exchange. In the classical episteme, value was defined as representation of the equivalence of all objects established through exchange. In the modern episteme, value was seen as rooted in a deep primordial organic force beyond and beneath representation in the activity of labor. Accordingly, production displaced circulation in becoming the foundational principle of political economy. Now, let us look now at Foucault's presentation of political economy in the light of the way in which I have spoken about the local so far. Now, the primacy of production was not rejected in the debate over the legitimacy of the method and Ricardian political economy, the debate that I refer to. In that, the primacy of production was not rejected, but it was recast. Concurring with Foucault, I argued that production as the organizing principle of political economy was discursively constituted at an autonomous level of reality. But right at a time when Ricardian ideas were gaining public attention in Britain, the local reconstituted the universality of production as difference using the same epistemic logic. Historicity, marking production's depth, was mobilized to rewrite the category as determined by sovereignty property difference. This meant that on the one hand, the universality of production got reconfigured as difference, while on the other, its autonomy got displaced by power in the form of sovereignty property ensembles. This is why political economists like James Mill, John McCulloch, Richard Jones, and John Stuart Mill, in the debate over the universality of Ricardian political economy, ultimately moved towards examinations of the different forms of political power existent in different nations of the world. In arguing over the definition of rent, they ended up emphasizing how forms of sovereignty giving rise to different kinds of function as conditions of production. Production therefore became a derivative of power and difference at the very moment of the inception of political economy, as a particular epistemic formation of modernity. Now, this reconditioning of political economy by the category of the local, I argue, can be considered a necessary analytical bridge to step into Foucault's understanding of governance. In his lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault notes that he has tried to grasp the level of reflection in the practice of government and on the practice of government. He calls his object of study the art of government, distinguishing it from real governmental practice. Instead of taking governance as a given category by equating it with the established universals of sociology, history, or political philosophy, he attempts to examine it immanently in terms of its self-reflection. This reflection, he argues, changed in its character from the 18th century in Europe. The change was about establishing, I quote, a principle of limitation that will no longer be extrinsic to the art of government, as was law in the 17th century, but intrinsic to it, an internal regulation of governmental rationality, unquote. This transformation gave birth to modern governmental reason. Then Foucault specifies that this principle of internal limitation came into governance economy. Political economy, other than being an analysis of the production and distribution of wealth, generally meant a mode of reflecting on the economy of power in society. Therefore, Foucault remarks, I quote, I think that fundamentally it was political economy that made it possible to ensure the self-limitation of governmental reason. Before digging deeper into this connection between political economy and governmental reason, let me clarify the location of the local in it. Following Foucault, it is evident that political economy was lodged into governmental reason as a self-reflexive principle of limitation of power. By reconstituting the universality of political economic categories in terms of difference, the local was performing the same function in early 19th century Britain. In making political economy reflective, not only of its method and categories, but also of variations in the form and distribution of power all over the world, the local prefigured the problem of governance. That is why both the debates in political economy in Britain and the practice of agrarian governance in British India extensively engaged with the question of modes of distribution of power in society, as manifested in varying arrangements of property. Political economy became governmental reason, as the meanings of the categories of the former could only be accessed as reflections on the distribution of power from within the practices of the latter. So, in conceptual resonances of the local in Foucault's discussion of the different traditions that inform this new governmental rationality of self-limitation of sovereignty. In Europe, since the end of the 18th century, Foucault notes that historically there emerged two approaches to this problem of how to set juridical limits to the exercise of power by a public authority. He terms them the French revolutionary approach and the English utilitarian approach. The former began with law and ended with government. It considered the question of juridical limits from the perspective of the original or natural rights of man against sovereignty, thereby determining how these rights can be modified and redefined. The latter moved in the reverse direction, analyzing government itself to arrive at the problem of legal limitation. Here, the logic of limitation was derived from history or tradition, but in a way that matched the ends of useful and desirable government. Interestingly, Foucault comes to this conclusion by referring to the history of property. I quote, between these two heterogeneous systems, that of the revolutionary axiomatic of public law and the rights of man, and that of the empirical and utilitarian approach, which defines the sphere of independence of the governed on the basis of the necessary limitation of government, there is a ceaseless connection and a whole series of bridges consider the history of property rights, for example. Now, this is how I kind of make sense of uh, the role of the local in this work. To further reflect on it, I would also like to briefly make some observations on the question of scale in this whole work, because it should be evident that it's absolutely central to this work. Now, at the heart of my analysis is an attempt to problematize the geographical essentialism of scalar categories, like the local. Speaking to existing histories of, for example, empire and nation, I ask whether the scalar units of the regional, the national, the imperial, or even the global, as they have been produced in existing historical scholarship, pay attention to the geographical unclassifiability of scalar categories. The local in this book demonstrates this condition of unscalability, whereby geographical sites of an amazing variety work in the local without making geographical territory its defining dynamic. Now, the local, as I see it, can be called an abstract machine, using Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the abstract machine from the Thousand Plateaus, which for the assemblage of political economy in 19th century Agrarian India, it generates the machinic states of dispersal, differentiation, flight, and deterritorialization. It produces variability, it sets up the strata, determines the codes, forms, and substances of the assemblage. The local, therefore, retains a scalar character without making the scale coincide with geographical formations. It makes scale concrete and metaphorical. It works as force and strata at the same time, opening up the assemblage to perpetual motion. I think I'll stop here and let the discussion, let anything that remains unclear discussed in the Q&A or the discussion session. Thank you. Thank you so much.